All right, so Jonathan, imagine this. It's 1990. You are a coffee roaster doing this pretty niche thing at the time, roasting specialty coffee. You're at the annual conference of the Specialty Coffee Association of America. What would you expect to do?
I'd expect to do the things I'd expect to see on the program. I'd go to the sessions on, how to buy your beans, where to buy from, ways of grading.
Yeah, rather dry stuff. So imagine your shock. A guy called Paul Katzeff bursts in to the Claremont Hotel, and they are banging drums, they are shouting and screaming, and they get these buckets of red blood, well, actually paint, and they just dump them over the stairs, and you can watch the waves of paint dripping down the stairs, cascading down, and everyone's shouting, "You, coffee roaster, you have blood in your hands."
Do you know what? I'm shocked.
And so, Jonathan, why was Paul Katzeff so angry?
So Katzeff is angry because his government, the US government, is supporting many of the regimes in Central America that are using their military against their own people. The blood is the blood of people being killed in this violence that is all built around coffee.
And what's really interesting is that out of this political anger comes a number of brands that we all know fairly well. Fairtrade, Rainforest Alliance. These are certifications.
If you think about walking down the supermarket aisle, you're looking at lots of brands of coffee, but some of them have these little flags on. So if you think about the Fairtrade label or the Rainforest Alliance frog, these are easy things that you can recognize on your coffee bag.
Yeah, and as a consumer, you can see this label and you can think, aha, this coffee aligns with my ethics. And when you set that against the story we've explored across the first 4 episodes of coffee going from Africa, being colonized across the world, exploiting people, and then the environment, and the uncontrolled markets race to the bottom, this is the moment where consumers can actually change the course of the supply chain.
Well, I think the first thing is it's the moment where consumers become aware of that supply chain. Mm-hmm. What we've seen, particularly in that race to the bottom, is coffee becoming kind of an everyday good that you don't ever really think about. You just spoon out your instant into your cup. Now people are saying, you've got to have to some thinking about this. This is not all just, oh great, because it's cheap.
And in this episode, we're going to unpack what are the origins of the certification movement. And how much success did certifications have in controlling this race to the bottom? I'm James Harper, the creator of Filter Stories, a coffee documentaries podcast.
And I'm Professor Jonathan Morris, author of Coffee, A Global History.
And this is the 5th episode of A History of Coffee, the story of how a tiny psychoactive seed changed the world and shapes our lives today. So Jonathan, we know that certifications came along to fix problems that came about through this uncontrolled race to the bottom. This is what we've been exploring across the last 4 episodes. And I think you could make an argument that, by the early 90s, the time when certifications were coming onto the world stage, the situation in coffee was pretty dire.
So, James, yeah, it is a very messy situation.
So for the first part of this episode, let's unpack what was going wrong in coffee in the early 90s.
Number 1, the price of coffee following the collapse of the cartel has halved. Second, environmentally, we're seeing this big intensification of coffee farming, really destroying the ecology and environment around it. But the thing that's really striking, the reason why we're pouring blood or fake blood, is that in many of the key coffee lands, there are huge conflicts going on where quite often the state and its armies and militias are attacking coffee workers and indigenous people who work the coffee industry.
So let's start with price. What happened?
So, end of the Cold War, America's pulled out of the International Coffee Agreement.
And the International Coffee Agreement was a cartel amongst coffee-producing countries backed by America, and they pulled out as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed.
Yeah, absolutely. Price falls down to probably about 50-60% of what it was. If you're a coffee farmer, that means your income falls by the same amount usually.
So you're saying that coffee farmers' incomes by the early 90s have collapsed to just 40% of what they were a few years before?
Yes. In essence, if you're a coffee farmer and you're producing the same amount of coffee, your price collapses by that amount, then your income goes down by that amount.
What does that mean for the lives of coffee farmers in, Central and South America and elsewhere?
It means that you are really pushed to survive. You are probably going to go hungry. The people that you perhaps employ to come and pick your coffee, to give you a hand on the farm, those people, you can't afford to pay them, so you don't hire them. So if you don't hire them, how are those people going to live?
Yeah.
That is a real problem.
And then on the environmental front, you mentioned that environmentally speaking, coffee farms are not great. So imagine, we're in southern Mexico. What does that mean on the ground?
Imagine we're standing at the top of a hill.
Okay.
And we're going to look one way.
Mm-hmm.
And there we're seeing, what coffee farming traditionally looked like. We're seeing lots of trees. You're seeing little terraces and shady trees around them. You're listening to the birds because there's a beautiful bird noise. You're probably getting bitten because there are quite a lot of insects flying around.
Right.
Now I want you to turn round and look over the hill the other way, and there's no shade trees there. There's just reams and lines of coffee trees. And those lines of coffee trees are much closer together. So what you're seeing is a much more intensive form of coffee agriculture, which will produce more coffee in terms of beans, but is denuding the environment. I can't hear the birds, and that's because the birds haven't got those insects to feed on. So you're looking at something that will give us more coffee, but is actually doing us harm as a planet.
And why aren't the insects there?
The insects aren't there, James, because we've developed the effective pesticides to go with the fertilizers to make this happen. So we're spraying them from above and we're fertilizing from below.
So it's a pretty toxic environment to be if you're an insect.
It's a very sterile environment, yeah.
And I would imagine if you were to pick up the soil from this fertilizer insecticide side of the mountain, it almost be like sandy soil, not much going on there. And then if you were to pick up the soil from the shade grown with the insects and the birds on the other side, it would smell. It would be alive with critters and nutrients.
Yeah.
And Jonathan, can you give me a sense of the scale of the environmental problem?
It's quite interesting because you could say that a lot of this story goes down to North American bird watchers.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, because North American bird watchers realized that the birds that migrated from South America to North America, they were seeing fewer and fewer of.
Oh, interesting.
They were trying to work out why that was, and it didn't seem to be anything in North America, and they realized that it was because they simply didn't have enough food in their Southern American habitats. The rainforest is where those habitats are.
Right.
So this sort of pointed to the ecological consequence of what was going on in the rainforest areas.
So now let's turn to the political violence side of things, the bit that, Paul Katzeff was particularly enraged about.
Yeah.
When he poured the buckets of blood down the stairs of the Claremont Hotel.
Yeah.
Imagine you are a farmer in El Salvador. You're on your farm, on a mountain slope. What would be going on around you?
Well, going on around me, my farm is a battle zone. I won't necessarily see a battle there every day, but I'll be hearing the planes flying over. I'll be seeing troops on a road. Probably I'm finding bodies. Might find a body on my farm, and then out of the trees come these guys who tell me they're fighting for my people, for a better world, and they want me to give them money because they're looking after the people who pick my coffee, and they're going to tax me so that they can keep their side of their fight going. So I'm stuck in the middle.
So the guys in the trees, they would be, the guerrillas. They are the kind of left-wing revolutionaries, which were fighting the government of many Central American countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua. And these governments are propped up by the USA. So they are fighting US-backed troops.
Yeah.
So Jonathan, let's take a step back, and here are the three big problems. In the early 90s, you have the coffee price, which is so low, and it is very difficult to eke out a living as a coffee farmer. You have this industrial coffee growing with lots of pesticides, fertilizers, and no shade trees. It's bad for the insects. It's bad for the birds. And then, of course, you have a lot of coffee farmers in the middle of civil wars. So this is the state of coffee in the early 90s. So what comes out of all of this?
What comes out of it, James, is a shift in public consciousness towards the idea of doing something. And that leads to the whole notion of we need a fair price for coffee. And how do we do that?
Jonathan, I think the most well-known certification is Fairtrade. And I'm curious to know, what is the story? Where did that come from?
Okay, so most people would trace the roots of fair trade in coffee to a moment in 1988. And this is at the time when it's really to do with Mexico. Mexico was going through a terrible set of upheavals in the late 80s, early 90s. It had an economic crisis in the early 80s. It had a problem with its coffee growing areas in particular, which is that while other sections of the Mexican economy were growing, the fortunes of the Mexican coffee industry were declining. The Mexican industry is based in the very south of the country, in the Chiapas region. And there basically was a lot of political unrest there too, a lot of issues around that. The definitive issue is that group of Dutch, basically religious group, Solidaridad, reached out to the Mexican Chiapas peasantry and said, well, what are the issues here? What's necessary? And they explained, what's necessary is we get a better price for our coffee. And again, the Mexican peasant laborers had these common lands.
Right.
So there was a sort of cooperative system. They wanted that supported as the indigenous organization system, and that was being falling apart.
Right. Okay, so let me just recap this. So there were some southern Mexican coffee farmers who were having a really tough time. I mean, there was low coffee prices, but the country as a whole, I know in the early 80s had collapsed economically. The government wasn't paying its debt. So these coffee farmers were desperate. They needed better prices. And these Dutch religious organizations reached out.
Correct. So you had that reach out, and the Dutch guy said, okay, right, we'll try and think of ways to deal with this. And they were going to buy some coffee and market it. And they then went to some Dutch companies, and the company said, well, look, if you certify this coffee as being fairly traded, we'll do the distributing.
Oh, okay.
And that created the idea of, okay, we'll have a label that conveys it's been certified. And that label originally was called Max Havelaar.
Now that's a name from the second episode. Jonathan, bring us up to speed again.
Max Havelaar is the key character in a novel written by a Dutch administrator in the East Indies. The hero of this novel, Max Havelaar, goes out and is appalled at the way that in Java there can be famine under Dutch rule when you supposedly have this wonderfully fertile land. And the reason there's famine is that the Dutch system indulged and was corrupt and allowed the great landowners, the local regent, to pretty much exploit his peasants to death.
Wow.
Now, the interesting thing about Havelaar is that it's got several different characters in it. One is Havelaar out in Java. The other is a character in a coffee auction house who's in a sort of an accountant. His name in Dutch means something like dry as dust. It's a remarkably onomatopoeic name. And this guy is sort of full of every Dutch prejudice that exists at the time. So it's, how can these people be so lazy? Why can't they grow better coffee? Blah, 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 blah.
Wow.
So the novel is a scandal because what it does is put the Dutch Empire on trial.
Wow.
These scandals are happening. This is the consequence of the way that we govern, and we let this happen. So Max Havelaar becomes a very, very emotive novel. It's written in about 1860. In 1988, the Max Havelaar name is adopted as the certification name, if you like, the brand for Fairtrade coffee. Mm-hmm. Now, the Havelaar name obviously has resonance in the Netherlands, but it really doesn't have resonance once it comes to moving beyond that. And that's where the name Fairtrade, as a way of sort of conveying what's involved, becomes used.
Jonathan, listen, as a coffee drinker, it can feel very overwhelming at times with all the different labels that are on these coffee bags. So for a couple of minutes, let's just talk about what's what and how, say, for example, Fairtrade works.
Fairtrade, there was a floor price available of $1.40 for the farmer.
So Fairtrade is really focused on prices.
It's the only one that includes a guaranteed price for the farmer, okay?
You're a coffee farmer. Imagine you are now part of a Fairtrade system. How does that work for you?
Okay, so I know what the minimum price I'm going to receive for my coffee is. That is the fundamental benefit of Fairtrade for me. It tells me my coffee will always sell for the Fairtrade price.
So Jonathan, let's imagine a situation where, the coffee price is, let's say it's less than $1 a pound.
Yeah.
So in this circumstance, I don't care who you are. It's almost impossible to make a profit out of that.
You absolutely couldn't.
Now, Fairtrade would pay you more than that, right?
So right now, Fairtrade price is $1.40 per pound.
So if you are a Fairtrade certified farmer and the coffee price is less than $1 a pound, you have the option of selling your coffee as Fairtrade and receiving $1.40 as opposed to less than $1 a pound.
But I don't necessarily end up selling all of it as Fairtrade. That depends on there being a Fairtrade buyer.
Gotcha. Okay, so other certifications?
If we do environmental, we have bird friendly. Primarily it means that it's grown on farms which have coffee shade and take care of the ecosystem around them sufficient to sustain that ecosystem, notably the birds.
So lots of shade trees equals lots of birds, and that's good for the environment.
Yeah.
Next.
Similar environmental one, Rainforest Alliance. You don't destroy the rainforest, that you adhere to certain environmental production systems.
And Rainforest Alliance is a very popular certification, but I think there are two things that everyday coffee drinkers may not realize about how it works.
Okay, two things about Rainforest Alliance. First of all, there's no guaranteed price.
And because there's no price floor, in theory, a coffee farmer who pays for a Rainforest Alliance certification may not earn any more money than the commodity price, the market price for their coffee, in theory.
In theory, that's the case, and it can be in practice. Second thing, they will certify a blend of coffee which contains only a percentage of coffee that's actually certified Rainforest Alliance. If 30% of the coffee in a blend marketed by a coffee company comes from Rainforest Alliance certified coffee, they may put that label on the bag.
Even though a larger percentage of the coffee in the bag is not Rainforest Alliance certified.
That's correct. They feel that the cause is important, and therefore they have to make sure that coffee companies are able to push out Rainforest Alliance certified coffees and raise awareness of this issue.
Okay, next certification.
4Cs. 4Cs is a very basic set of standards for, if you like, ethical behavior at the level of commodity coffee purchase. And the great advantage of that one, it's very, very cheap for farmers to get themselves certified 4C.
Gotcha. So this is a very simple certification for producers. It's very cheap to certify. And it offers buyers, roasters, who buy commodity coffee, assurance that the coffee farmer has met a very basic set of sustainability standards. Great. Next.
Organic, probably the most familiar to us in terms of the standards around organic, what you can and can't treat plants with, that you shouldn't obviously use pesticides, blah, blah. The interesting thing to note about organic is the most profitable certification for coffee farmers. It enables you to get quite a significantly higher price for your coffee. It doesn't have a premium built into it like Fairtrade, but the amount that you tend to get for organic coffee will be significantly higher than the Fairtrade price.
But the flip side is that you can grow a lot less coffee on your farm. So although you get a higher price because you're growing less coffee, it's not like you're earning dramatically more from your farm.
Exactly.
Okay, any more certifications to mention?
Then you've got companies who produce their own certification schemes. So you have the Starbucks cafe system, effectively using its own inspectors to inspect its own suppliers. I would say, James, that what it resembles to me in easy terms is to think of it as a preferred supplier solution in the way that you have in many big corporations, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
So Nespresso have their own one. It's the AAA certification.
And Jonathan, one thing I have to mention, because it may not be obvious, is that it is the farmer's responsibility to get their own farm or cooperative certified. As in, it's a cost on the farmer to be able to sell their coffee as certified coffee.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so Jonathan, let's zoom forward from the 90s more towards, the present day. And how successful, how popular have these certification schemes been? And I mean, how do you even gauge the success of a certification?
That is a difficult gauge, but if you want a very simple one, how much of the percentage of the world's coffee is certified something?
Okay.
And the answer to that is very high, actually. It's, between 40 to 50% now.
Is certified something?
Is certified something. But I tell you that the interesting thing about that, James, I'm looking at a table here which tells me how much basically of the production that is certified is actually sold in terms of sales, okay, under its certification, as opposed to being sold as regular coffee. And that is about, in 2013 for Fairtrade, that was about a third. And that's actually true for nearly all of these certifications, that it's around a third.
Hold the phone. Okay. Let's unpack this.
Yeah.
So, for example, Fairtrade, roughly a third of the coffee that farmers had paid money to get certified as Fairtrade coffee.
Yeah.
Only a third of their coffees was actually sold as Fairtrade. And the other 2/3, which they had paid to get certified, got sold without a certification and therefore without the price floor that...
Correct.
Hold on. If I'm a farmer and I pay to have my coffee certified, but I can only get the minimum fair trade price for a third of it, and 2/3 is the much lower, market global price.
Yeah.
I mean, that's that.
I'm hearing your mind boggle. And I understand your problem. But of course, the problem is you're the farmer. There's a market for your fair trade, but it isn't for all of your coffee. There aren't enough buyers in the market for that fair trade coffee. And that's the problem right there. You've certified it, so you can charge the higher price, but someone has to pay it for it to happen.
Right.
And you've still got the coffee, so you've got to get rid of it, because otherwise it's absolutely no value, is it? You don't want it hanging around. So you're going to sell it on for the best price that you can get. That's the problem for all of these certification schemes. So you, as a farmer, this doesn't necessarily offer you a route to prosperity at all.
Now, you could definitely see this as a pretty damning indictment of certifications. I mean, I'm a consumer. I have paid extra for my certified coffee, but the farmer isn't getting as much benefit as I would expect them to for going through the rigmarole or the effort and stress of having to certify the farm. this system isn't as helpful to farmers as I want it to be as a coffee drinker. But as far as like the big roasteries are concerned, what are they doing with certified coffee?
So look, James, there are some big coffee companies in particular, big coffee roasters, who develop brands, some of which are fair trade brands, which they use to supply those clients that demand a fair trade range. For example, I work in universities. Nearly all universities demand whoever supplies their catering outlets is using fair trade coffee.
Huh.
So that becomes a portion of their coffee, but it's not all of their coffee market by any means. If I looked at, 2013, 2014, the amount of coffee that the big companies bought that was certified, I'm thinking of places like JAB, like Nestle, they're buying around 30%.
So for these big coffee brands, so some of them, 30% of all the green coffee they buy from farmers is certified coffee.
Now, some buy a lot more. Some, 2013, so Strauss, very big roaster primarily around the Middle East, 2%. And then I'm looking at Lavazza and I see 1%. Now, Lavazza is interesting because Lavazza do have an ethically certified blend, which is called Tierra. And I know there's a lot of social projects done around Tierra.
But it suggests that only 1% of consumers are interested in actually paying more for some kind of ethically certified coffee from Lavazza. 1% of Lavazza drinkers. So Jonathan, so why is it the case that so much certified coffee was grown by farmers, but so little of it is purchased by consumers?
Well, the issue is that consumers need to demand fair trade coffee. If there's a demand for fair trade coffee, then that puts the incentive on the roaster manufacturer to acquire it. If the consumer doesn't make that questioning, or if the consumer ignores that label for something else, then the companies aren't going to purchase at fair trade. Fair trade tried to make the system visible to consumers, giving them the choice of supporting it or not.
Right.
Now, unfortunately, not all coffee consumers are motivated by ethics. And indeed, many more, particularly in those markets where, in effect, poorer people have to spend more proportionately on their coffee, they are probably going to be more interested in the price.
Right.
Yeah. So if you market coffee to an affluent community, many of them will look for the fair trade and they'll pay a little bit more for it. If you want to expand mass sales, probably that market is not looking for the fair trade label. They would probably like to think that you have ethically acquired your coffee. We all would. We probably expect some of those big brand names that we know to do just that. Some of them try and do that through those more basic certification schemes like the 4C. But the bottom line is that, this is down to the consumers to keep making those challenges. It will be consumer preference in the end.
It feels like a paradox. Farmers pay good money to get their coffee certified. And, maybe they can sell a third of their coffee as certified coffee and the rest is, at low prices. And the reason they can't get the floor price, like the price that they need when times are really bad in the coffee market, is because not enough of us consumers, coffee drinkers, have chosen the fair trade label. Like many of us have, but not enough of us have. And I really wonder, will there ever be enough people who are willing to pay a bit more for their coffee to make, say, the fair trade certification scheme actually work for farmers like it's supposed to?
I fear not. I fear not, because actually fair trade coffee tastes no different than commodity coffee. So if I served you a Fairtrade coffee and a commodity coffee from the same region, quite possibly from that same farm, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. But yet I'm asking you as a consumer to pay me that difference. So you're asking consumers to pay for ethics alone, not for ethics plus quality.
And not just fair trade. Indeed, I think this applies to many certifications.
And indeed, James, between you and me, even organic coffee. If we can't taste the difference in the cup, we're really endorsing the practices in the field. So there are consumers for whom that is important, and there will be a growing number of consumers, but I don't think it will ever be all consumers.
We would need a pretty fundamental revolution in the perception of coffee globally for that to kind of happen. So Jonathan, now we know a bit more about how successful these certifications were. Were they all just a bit of a waste of time? I mean, we had those three big problems in the beginning. We had the low prices, we had the environmental destruction, and we had the politically motivated violence in coffee producing countries. I mean, it's not like these problems have gone away necessarily. Did certifications fix this system?
They haven't cured the system, but they've raised the profile and created the questioning. And they've created, a presence.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting, because without certifications, would there be this awareness, this focus on the sustainability of the coffee industry? But can we pinpoint a time when, these sustainability issues and the work of the certifications to raise awareness kind of really hit the headlines?
Yeah, I mean, if I can give you an example, James. Okay, 1998, the ICO composite indicator for coffee. So this weighs up the various different kinds of coffee prices. So that was at 109 US cents per pound in 1998. Now, that's not great.
Yeah, I mean, that's low. 109 cents in 1990 per pound of green coffee.
That is low. 2002, that is under 48 cents. Okay?
Wow. So it goes down by over half?
It goes down by over half, and it wasn't high anyway.
Wow.
If we assume that, mostly we say that $1 is the minimum to sort of get back your costs.
Yeah, as a coffee farmer.
It's not until 2007 that we get back above $1.
Wow. Because we opened the episode with, one of the big problems, the price collapse of the early 90s.
Yeah.
And here we have, early 2000s. You thought that was bad?
Exactly.
It got even worse.
No, you're exactly right. That's exactly what happened. So we had the price crisis of the early 90s immediately after the end of the ICA, but this is on a different scale entirely. This is meltdown in the coffee world. And this really, I think, projects into public consciousness because it is used by Fairtrade, it is used by charities to really highlight the issue. So there's a fantastic report done by Oxfam, and the whole thing is called Poverty in Your Cup, and they make a huge thing. And of course, this links to the point at which coffee shops, Starbucks format coffee shop, if you like, the international coffee shop chain, they were becoming much more popular. So there's this sudden thing about, well, whoa, hang on, you're asking me for these fancy prices for these fancy coffees, but what the hell is going on here? And that is what I think projects these issues into public consciousness. And I think it really projected the notion of the need to think about the ethics of coffee, the need to demonstrate that your company was taking these issues seriously.
So Jonathan, certifications, yes, they didn't fix the system, but they did a lot of great work to raise awareness about the sustainability problems in the coffee industry. But we're still left with this basic problem. The first 4 episodes of this series explored how coffee became this kind of uncontrolled animal that raced down to the bottom. And this is a massive problem because a lot of the coffee farmers, the billions and millions of coffee farmers around the world who don't have very much money. They don't have many economic opportunities outside of coffee growing to put food on the table. They're stuck in a system where they can't earn very much money, and it's basically a poverty trap. And, along came certifications to try and fix the problem, and they did do something, but the problems still exist. So, what next?
Well, James, the other way of looking at it, which we'll look at next time, is why don't we pay a lot more for our coffee?
Right.
Specialty coffee.
Specialty coffee. The notion of, a high quality coffee that we pay more money for.
Yeah. So reverse the whole race to the bottom. Let's have a race up.
Right. So that's what we're going to be exploring in the next episode. Where did specialty coffee come from? And what were the promises of this movement in terms of changing the coffee world? And ultimately, how much of an impact has it had and is today having?
But also, I'm hoping that at the end we'll think about, how this whole story, where does it go next? What is it that we've seen happen? What have we seen with those places that we've stopped off on our journey? Ethiopia, Yemen, Brazil, Central America, Africa, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, China maybe. And think about, how are these countries going to experience coffee in the future?
What will the world blend taste like in 50 years' time? Thank you for listening to this 5th episode. If you'd like to help others find this show, it would mean a lot to us, and a really great way of doing that is to write a review on Apple Podcasts.
If you would also like to go deeper into coffee history, please follow the link to my book in the show notes, Coffee, A Global History.
This podcast was produced by myself and yourself, Jonathan, and I wrote and played the piano music.
You did, James. Thanks to everyone, and looking forward to speaking to you next time.